In March 1944, deep within the Japanese Naval Intelligence Headquarters at the Oda Communications Unit, Commander Atsuzo Kurihara sat before a series of intercepted American radio transmissions, the messages captured during the U.S. Marine Corps Marshall Islands operation had defied every analytical method at the command's disposal. Kurihara's third cup of bitter tea had long gone cold as his team, Japan's best cryptan, struggled to decode what sounded like a structured military language. They recognized timing patterns that coincided with American assaults and frequencies consistent with Marine Corps tactical communications, yet the content itself was a mystery. The sounds were distinctly human, rhythmic, and purposeful, but entirely unlike English or any other known Allied language. The commander, a veteran of Japan's celebrated code breaking efforts, was baffled. 3 years into the war, his intelligence network had cracked multiple American, British, and diplomatic codes. They had even broken the U.S. State Department's Purple Code before Pearl Harbor, an achievement that gave Japan vital strategic advantages. But now these new messages, filled with strange tones and sounds, represented total failure. Kurihara didn't yet know it, but what he was hearing would go down in history as the only unbroken code of modern warfare. The secret of that code did not originate in Washington or a classified laboratory. It began centuries earlier in the deserts and canyons of the American Southwest. There, the Navajo people, or Dine, had preserved one of the most linguistically complex and unique languages on Earth. Known as Dine Bizard, the Navajo language belonged to the Athabascan family, and by 1940 was spoken by roughly 170,000 people living primarily within a vast 27,000 square mile reservation spanning Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. To outsiders, Navajo was more than difficult. It was virtually indecipherable. The language was verb-centered, relying on intricate prefix combinations that could create millions of possible word forms. Its structure allowed verbs to convey ideas that required entire sentences in English. Moreover, the language was tonal. 4 tones high, low, rising, and falling could completely change meaning. A single mispronunciation could transform a sentence into nonsense. Its phonetic features were alien to non-native speakers. Ejective stops, nasalized vowels, and glottalized consonants made the language almost impossible for those without lifelong immersion to even reproduce correctly. For Japanese analysts, whose native language contained only 5 vowel sounds, discerning these subtle phonetic differences was beyond reach. One man, however, recognized the potential of this linguistic fortress as a weapon of war. Philip Johnston, born in 1892 to a Protestant missionary on the Navajo reservation, had grown up speaking Navajo fluently. He was one of fewer than 30 non-Navajos in the world who could claim fluency. By the age of 9, he was translating sermons for his father. By 15, he was in Washington, D.C., serving as a translator for Navajo leaders in a meeting with President Theodore Roosevelt. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Johnston, now an engineer and World War I veteran, read about U.S. Army training exercises that had used Comanche speakers to transmit secret messages. He realized that while native languages had been used informally in the past, such as by Choctaw soldiers in World War I, the approach had never been systematized or fully integrated into military communication. Johnston's insight was revolutionary. Create an entire tactical code based on the Navajo language, one that would be secure not because of mechanical encryption, but because of the language's sheer linguistic complexity and cultural obscurity. On February 28, 1942, Johnston presented his proposal to Major General Clayton Vogel at Camp Elliott near San Diego. Vogel was intrigued but skeptical. To test the idea, Johnston recruited 4 Navajo men from Los Angeles for a live demonstration. The results astonished the Marine officers observing. The Navajo speakers transmitted a coded message in just 20 seconds, a task that took the standard M209 cipher machine 30 minutes. The demonstration's success convinced Vogel to authorize a pilot program. On May 4, 1942, 29 Navajo recruits were sworn in at Fort Wingate, New Mexico. These young men, Chester Nez, Carl Gorman, Lloyd Oliver, and John Benelli among them, came from diverse backgrounds. Some had been punished in government-run boarding schools for speaking Navajo, while others had grown up herding sheep on the reservation, far from modern cities. Now, they would use the very language once suppressed by the U.S. government as a powerful weapon against Japan. At Camp Elliott, the recruits were locked inside a guarded building for 8 weeks. Their mission was monumental: invent a secure military code using Navajo. They had to devise terminology for modern warfare concepts that had no equivalents in their language. Terms like submarine, battleship, and machine gun. The men relied on their culture's deep relationship with nature and metaphor. A submarine became bishlo, or iron fish. A battleship was lot, so meaning whale. Fighter planes became dohiti-hai, or hummingbird, reflecting speed and agility, while bombers were jaish-o, buzzards, circling above. To further protect the code, they developed an alphabet system assigning multiple Navajo words to each English letter, preventing frequency analysis. The letter E, for example, had 4 different Navajo words. Every code talker memorized all terms. No written codebooks were allowed, as capture could mean catastrophic exposure. We drilled endlessly. Chester Nez later recalled, "A mistake could cost lives. In our culture, words have power. Speaking correctly was sacred." Within months, they had created a system both profoundly simple and utterly unbreakable, a linguistic weapon born of heritage and genius. The Navajo Code Talkers' first true test came in the summer of 1942, when 15 of them landed with the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal. The battle marked the first major Allied offensive against Japanese forces in the Pacific, and it quickly became a brutal, chaotic campaign fought in the dense jungles of the Solomon Islands. The Japanese had proven themselves masters of intercepting and decoding Allied communications. Before the Code Talkers arrived, their cryptanalysts had successfully broken several U.S. and British codes, allowing them to anticipate attacks and plan countermeasures. But as the Marines came ashore at Guadalcanal, a sudden and bewildering silence fell over Japanese intelligence networks. Their radio interception teams began recording strange transmissions that bore no resemblance to anything they had encountered before. The timing matched Marine operations, the signals were clearly organized, but the content was entirely alien. Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada, a Stanford-educated officer fluent in English, French, and several Asian languages, described his confusion in a field report. "The sounds are structured like language," he wrote, "but it matches nothing. No English, French, Dutch, Spanish, or any dialect of the Philippines or China. It is completely foreign, yet deliberate." Within days, the Japanese Navy's intelligence units began frantic efforts to identify the mysterious source. They recorded hundreds of hours of transmissions, pressing their top cryptanalysts into service. Teams applied every known method: frequency analysis, word, length measurement, and even tonal pattern mapping. They brought in university linguists, historians, and Buddhist monks familiar with ancient languages. None of it worked. Every technique that had unlocked Allied codes before now failed completely. The more they listened, the more perplexed they became. The sounds, though patterned, seemed to change constantly. No repeated sequences, no predictable structure. The code, if it was one, appeared alive, self-adapting, and impenetrable. The secret lay in the Navajo Code Talkers' method. When they transmitted messages, they were not simply speaking Navajo. They were using an entirely new coded vocabulary embedded within it. Common military terms were replaced by culturally derived metaphors: iron fish for submarine, buzzard for bomber, whale for battleship. They also used an alphabet code with multiple synonyms for each letter, ensuring that even if an enemy analyst recognized one pattern, another would immediately replace it. Since no written codebooks existed, everything depended on the talker's flawless memory and discipline. A single mistake could cause confusion on the battlefield or reveal patterns to the enemy, but the Navajo's training was relentless. They practiced for hours daily, transmitting under simulated battle conditions, learning to send and receive messages in seconds. Where standard cipher machines required half an hour to encrypt and decode a short message, the Navajos could complete the same task in under 20 seconds. On the chaotic front lines of Guadalcanal, that speed saved countless lives. One such moment came on November 8, 1942, when code talker Chester Nez transmitted artillery coordinates for a Japanese machine gun nest pinning down Marine troops. The message took 14 seconds to send, was instantly received and decoded by another code talker, and within minutes American artillery obliterated the target. Japanese operators intercepted the transmission but could make no sense of it. To them, it sounded like rhythmic chanting mixed with foreign intonations, something halfway between music and speech. They logged it, filed it, analyzed it, and failed again. Colonel Haruo Konyuma, an intelligence officer for Japan's 17th Army, later wrote in his report, "The Americans have deployed a code that defeats every attempt. We can no longer anticipate attacks. We are fighting blind." For Japan's intelligence corps, long considered among the best in the world, the experience was humiliating and psychologically crushing. They had cracked the British naval ciphers, the American diplomatic purple code, even Chinese and Soviet systems. But this new marine language resisted everything. In their desperation, Japanese intelligence officers turned to a Navajo man named Joe Kiyomiya, who had been captured earlier in the war during the Baton campaign. Kiyomiya was fluent in both English and Navajo, and his captors believed he could finally unlock the mystery. At the Orna Interrogation Center, they played him recordings of intercepted transmissions. He listened carefully but quickly realized that while he could recognize individual Navajo words, the messages themselves were nonsensical. "The turtle is attacking the iron fish," one transmission said. Another mentioned the hummingbird carrying eggs. To Kiyomiya, the sentences were gibberish, a strange mix of familiar words used in unfamiliar ways. When he failed to provide translations, the Japanese accused him of lying. His torture was brutal. He was beaten, waterboarded, hung by his arms for hours, and eventually forced to stand barefoot in snow until his skin froze. Still, he could not decode what he did not understand. In a May 1943 intelligence report, Japanese analysts reluctantly admitted defeat. The prisoner appears native to the mystery language but cannot comprehend messages. Assessment: either extraordinary resistance or enemy uses specialized code within native tongue requiring specific training. Their second conclusion was correct. Even a fluent Navajo speaker, without code talker training, would be unable to interpret the transmissions. That was the genius of the system. It was not merely a translation, but a parallel code inside the language itself. By late 1943, Japanese intelligence largely abandoned its attempts to decipher the messages, reallocating resources to other priorities. They had encountered something beyond their analytical framework. The empire's cryptographic pride, once a source of confidence, now symbolized failure. The code talkers had turned their ancestors' language, once deemed useless by American authorities, into the most secure communication system of the war. The success at Guadalcanal transformed U.S. military communications. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, reported, "The Navajo communicators have proven invaluable. Their transmissions are faster than any encoding device and absolutely secure." The Marine Corps immediately expanded the program, establishing a formal training school at Camp Pendleton. By the end of the war, between 375 and 420, Navajo Marines would serve as code talkers across all 6 Marine divisions. What began as an experiment had become one of the most decisive innovations in modern military history, a code not built on machines, but on the living breath of a people whose language was older than the nation they served. The extraordinary success of the Navajo Code Talkers at Guadalcanal marked a turning point in the Pacific War. What had started as a small experiment with 29 recruits now evolved into a vital communications network spread across multiple Marine divisions. By early 1943, the Marine Corps realized that the Navajo language had achieved what no machine or mathematician could: an unbreakable code that functioned flawlessly in real time under combat conditions. As a result, the Corps expanded the program dramatically, establishing an official Code Talker school at Camp Pendleton, California. Every 8 weeks, new classes of recruits, young Navajo men from across the reservation, were trained to join the ranks. By the end of the war, between 375 and 420, Navajo Marines would serve as code talkers, each carrying the invisible weight of a secret weapon that would change the outcome of the Pacific campaign. Training at Camp Pendleton was unlike any other program in Marine history. The recruits lived under strict secrecy, isolated from other soldiers. They practiced in soundproof booths where instructors blasted battlefield noises, machine gun fire, explosions, and shouting to simulate combat conditions. The men were drilled endlessly, transmitting messages while wearing gas masks, running through obstacle courses, or crawling under barbed wire. Every message had to be transmitted and decoded with perfect accuracy. A single syllable mispronounced, a tonal variation misplaced, could alter meaning and cost lives. Thomas B., who enlisted at just 15 years old, later recalled, "They pushed us beyond what we thought possible. Lives depended on our accuracy. We couldn't afford mistakes." The Code Talkers training was not only technical but also spiritual. Many of them came from deeply traditional families where words held sacred power. To them, speech carried life and consequence. They understood that using their language in war required immense respect and responsibility. As Chester Nez once explained, our words had to be precise. We were raised to believe that words have power, to heal, to bless, or to destroy. The code itself continued to evolve as warfare advanced. When new weapons, vehicles, or tactics were introduced, the Navajo Talkers expanded their vocabulary through collective innovation. Every addition followed the same cultural logic that had defined the original design. The atomic bomb, for instance, became a yashi, meaning metal egg, symbolizing both power and mystery. Kamikaze pilots were called Niti, death wind, capturing the terrifying suddenness of their attacks. Each new term was chosen carefully, intuitive for Navajo speakers yet completely incomprehensible to outsiders. The code's beauty lay in its organic adaptability, its ability to grow with the war without ever losing coherence or security. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence, desperate to recover from their earlier failures, intensified efforts to penetrate this linguistic armor. By mid-1943, the Imperial Navy's 4th Section dedicated 30 of its top cryptanalysts exclusively to studying the Navajo transmissions. Captain Yoshiro Tanaka led the team and attempted novel approaches beyond conventional cryptography. They used musical analysis to detect tonal patterns, acoustic mapping to visualize sound waves, and even borrowed recording equipment to slow down transmissions in hopes of distinguishing syllables. They studied Native American anthropological records from American universities, seeking clues in linguistic similarities. But no matter how sophisticated their analysis became, the barrier held. Without a deep understanding of Navajo grammar and culture, and without the internal code layered on top of it, they were essentially deciphering a code written in poetry from another world. Lieutenant Commander Masao Yamada, one of the lead analysts, later admitted that while they could identify probable call signs and even estimate message length, the substance remained inaccessible. Without understanding the words, he said, our findings had no value. Japanese field commanders grew increasingly frustrated. Orders were issued to capture Marine radio operators alive. A reward of 10,000 yen, nearly 10 years of a soldier's salary, was promised for any equipment, codebooks, or prisoners who could help decode the transmissions. Several code talkers came dangerously close to capture, but none were ever taken alive with their radios intact. They knew the consequences of falling into enemy hands. Each code talker was instructed that if capture seemed imminent, they must destroy their equipment, and if necessary themselves, to protect the code. The Japanese never succeeded. The following year, as the war spread across the Pacific, the Navajo Code Talkers became indispensable in every major campaign. During the ferocious Battle of Tarawa in November 1943, 6 Code Talkers maintained communication links for 76 consecutive hours. Lloyd Oliver, one of the original 29, transmitted continuously for 48 hours without rest, coordinating naval gunfire that supported Marines pinned under relentless Japanese counterattacks. Their ability to relay orders instantly and securely gave U.S. forces an operational edge that technology could not match. The Code Talkers were living encryption systems, faster than any machine, more precise than any algorithm. In 1944, during the Mariana Islands campaign, 24 Code Talkers operated around the clock at Saipan. Japanese intelligence, led by Lieutenant Commander Takashi Harukawa, had decoded conventional Allied messages in preparation for the invasion. But once the Marines landed and switched to Navajo Code, the Japanese lost all tactical awareness. Colonel Takashi Sato later lamented, "Commanders felt abandoned without the intelligence they depended upon. The absence of decoded transmissions left Japanese units blind to Marine maneuvers, artillery placements, and reinforcements." The result was devastating for Japan's defensive strategy. Later that same year at Peleliu, Code Talker Jimmy King demonstrated the unshakable courage and precision that defined his comrades. During an intense counterattack, his radio partner was killed beside him, but King continued transmitting alone for 6 hours under heavy fire. He coordinated artillery fire from 3 battalions and sent over 40 messages without error. His composure and dedication saved countless lives and ensured the success of the Marine advance. As the Pacific Campaign continued, the Code Talkers became an inseparable part of Marine operations. They could set up a radio line in minutes, transmit critical information instantly, and remain invisible to enemy intelligence. For every major amphibious landing, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the success of the initial assaults depended on their voices. Behind every barrage of artillery, every coordinated airstrike, and every call for evacuation, there was a Navajo Marine speaking into a handset, sending messages the enemy could never comprehend. By 1944, even Japanese commanders in Tokyo began to recognize the hopelessness of their efforts. They had expected to counter American technology with superior discipline and analysis. Instead, they faced an enemy whose greatest weapon was not mechanical but human, rooted in language, culture, and identity. The Navajo Code Talkers had created not just a tactical advantage but a paradigm shift. They proved that in a world of machines and mathematics, human ingenuity, shaped by culture, memory, and tradition, could achieve the impossible. By 1945, the Navajo Code Talkers had become an invisible backbone of U.S. Marine communications across the Pacific. Their unbreakable code had saved lives and turned the tide of battles from Guadalcanal to Saipan, yet their greatest test and greatest triumph was still ahead. As American forces prepared for the invasion of Iwo Jima, the war's intensity reached its peak. Japan's military leadership had transformed the island into a fortress, digging an underground network of tunnels and bunkers to resist the inevitable American assault. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of the Japanese garrison, had spent 2 years constructing the island's defenses and developing an elaborate counterattack plan based on intercepting American communications. What Kuribayashi could not anticipate, however, was that his greatest advantage, his army's skill in code breaking, was now useless. He was facing an enemy whose communications would remain impenetrable until the war's end. On February 19, 1945, as waves of Marines stormed the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo Code Talkers under Major Howard Connor established communication posts within minutes of landing. Working in pairs to maintain constant transmission, they relayed messages between front-line units and command ships offshore. In the first 48 hours alone, they sent and received more than 800 messages without a single error. Their speed and accuracy were beyond anything conventional encryption systems could achieve. Major Connor later testified, were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. During the first 48 hours, I had 6 Navajo radio nets operating around the clock. They sent and received over 800 messages without an error. The entire operation was directed by Navajo Code. The significance of this cannot be overstated. Every artillery strike, every air support call, every troop movement across Iwo Jima was coordinated through the Code Talkers' transmissions. The Japanese, desperate to decode them, intercepted countless messages, but all attempts led to confusion. Colonel Shija Hayashi, part of Kuribayashi's intelligence staff, admitted that the enemy's communications were completely unbreakable. Artillery requests that would have taken 30 minutes through standard encryption were completed in less than 20 seconds through Navajo. That difference meant the destruction of Japanese positions before they could mount a counterattack. The Code Talkers' work at Iwo Jima was not just a triumph of communication. It was a demonstration of how cultural intelligence and linguistic diversity could outperform even the most advanced military technology. Kuribayashi's meticulous defensive strategy collapsed as a result. His forces had relied on intercepting and interpreting American transmissions to trigger counteroffensives. Without that ability, Japanese units fought blindly, responding too late or not at all. The island's defenders fought with courage and desperation, but the Marines' coordination was too precise, their communication too fast. When Iwo Jima finally fell after 5 weeks of brutal combat, it came at a cost of nearly 7,000 American lives. But the victory was strategically decisive. And behind every successful strike, every troop movement, every supply drop, were Navajo voices weaving a linguistic shield the enemy could not penetrate. After Iwo Jima, the Code Talkers continued their crucial service during the Battle of Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific Theater. In April 1945, 5 Navajo Code Talkers were assigned to coordinate communications for the invasion's 183,000 troops. Okinawa was a nightmare of mud, rain, and relentless combat that lasted 82 days. Yet through it all, the Code Talkers maintained uninterrupted contact among Marine units, air support, and naval command. The Japanese, still unable to break the code, resorted to desperate countermeasures. They attempted to jam American frequencies and even mimic the Navajo transmissions by recording and replaying snippets in hopes of sowing confusion. Lieutenant Hiroshi Miyamoto led a small team that tried to imitate the Navajo sounds, but the effort failed miserably. According to Code Talker Alfred Newman, their imitation sounded like someone gargling while trying to talk. The tonal subtleties of the Navajo language, with its glottal stops and nasalized vowels, were impossible for outsiders to reproduce accurately. Even if they could mimic a few words, they could never replicate meaning or syntax. During the Okinawa campaign, the Code Talkers' speed and reliability again proved vital. When American lines were cut off or units became surrounded, they could send distress messages within seconds. Supply drops, medical evacuations, and artillery requests all flowed through the Navajo channels. The Japanese, who once prided themselves on their mastery of cryptography, were forced to admit total defeat in this domain. As the tide of war turned irreversibly against Japan, even their intelligence officers recognized that no human or machine could decipher the code the Marines were using. On August 14, 1945, as the war neared its end, Code Talker Teddy Draper transmitted one of the most significant messages in modern history. Nihi ma idigini adinil, Japanese surrender. Fittingly, the message announcing Japan's defeat first passed through the same Navajo Code that had helped ensure victory. For the men who had carried radios and microphones through jungles, across beaches, and into tunnels under fire, the moment was both triumphant and bittersweet. They had fulfilled their mission flawlessly, but their work, their sacrifices, and their voices remained hidden from public recognition. After the surrender, American intelligence teams interrogated Japanese officers to assess the extent of their code, breaking failures. The revelations were astonishing. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisu, Japan's chief of intelligence, confessed, "We never broke the Marine Code. We broke Army codes, Air Force codes, diplomatic traffic. But the Marine Tactical Code was completely secure." Captain Yasuji Kawamoto added, "We recorded thousands of transmissions. Our best linguists studied them for 3 years. Nothing worked. It was our greatest cryptanalytic failure." Japanese analysts had suspected the code might involve indigenous American languages, but they could never identify which one, nor understand its structure. They even requested assistance from German intelligence experts, but the effort came too late and without meaningful results. Colonel Masao Yamada later admitted, "Our inability to read marine communications cost thousands of lives. Every marine operation after 1942 was a mystery until it began. The psychological impact on Japanese officers was profound." Major Hiroshi Tanaka, a survivor of Iwo Jima, described it years later. "We couldn't understand their words. It made us feel primitive, defeated before battle even began." That confession encapsulated the deeper power of the Navajo Code Talkers' achievement. The Japanese Empire had defined itself through hierarchy, discipline, and technological superiority. Yet it was undone in part by something far older and more human, a language born from oral tradition, spirituality, and the rhythm of the natural world. For the Navajo Marines themselves, victory brought no public glory. Their mission remained classified for decades after the war. They returned home to reservations where they were denied basic civil rights. Many could not even vote in the states they had fought to defend. Hotels, restaurants, and schools often refused them service. They were heroes who could not tell anyone of their heroism. The secrecy of the program meant their families and communities knew little about the magnitude of their contribution. As Chester Nez later reflected, "We were warriors who helped win the war, but we couldn't tell anyone. The burden was heavy." Still, among the code talkers, pride endured. They knew what they had accomplished. They had used the language of their ancestors to protect lives, to defeat tyranny, and to reshape military history. They had proven that the very words once forbidden in boarding schools were powerful beyond measure, strong enough to defend an entire nation. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Navajo Code Talkers returned home to a nation that celebrated victory but knew nothing of their role in achieving it. Their mission remained shrouded in secrecy for decades. The U.S. military classified the entire program, fearing the code might be needed again in future conflicts. As a result, these men, who had carried the weight of an unbreakable code across the Pacific, who had risked their lives transmitting the messages that guided American victory, returned to silence. They could not tell their families, their communities, or even their fellow veterans what they had done. The secrecy that had protected the code now became a barrier between them and the recognition they deserved. For many, the transition back to civilian life was difficult and lonely. They went back to herding sheep, farming, and rebuilding their communities, carrying invisible scars from the horrors of war and the unspoken pride of an accomplishment they could not share. Adding to this pain was the bitter irony that many code talkers came home to states where they were still not recognized as full citizens. In Arizona and New Mexico, Native Americans were denied the right to vote until 1948. In Utah, that right didn't come until 1957. Hotels, restaurants, and even government offices refused them service. They had fought for freedom, but that freedom was not yet theirs. Yet the code talkers did not respond with bitterness. They carried themselves with quiet dignity. Chester Nez, the last of the original 20, 9 later wrote, "We were warriors who helped win the war, but couldn't tell anyone. The burden was heavy. In Navajo culture, words are sacred, and silence too holds power." Many sought spiritual cleansing through traditional ceremonies. The enemy way ceremony, long used to purify warriors returning from battle, became an essential part of their healing. As veteran Dan Erkey explained, we had used our language to direct death. We needed it again for healing. The ceremonies reminded us that our language was sacred. The U.S. government finally declassified the Navajo Code Talker program in 1968, more than 20 years after the war ended. Slowly, the world began to learn of their extraordinary contribution. Recognition came first within the Marine Corps, when surviving code talkers were invited to reunions and honored by fellow veterans who had relied on their voices in battle. In 1969, during a 4th Marine Division reunion, the first public acknowledgement was made of the Navajo Code Talkers' role in securing victory in the Pacific. From there, the story spread, capturing the imagination of historians, filmmakers, and educators. The secrecy that had once silenced their story now gave it even greater impact, a revelation of courage hidden for decades. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th as National Navajo Code Talkers Day, a symbolic gesture recognizing their heroism. But the most significant moment of recognition came on July 26, 2001, when President George W. Bush presented congressional gold medals to the original 29 code talkers in a ceremony at the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. Only 5 of the original group were still alive to attend. Standing among them, President Bush said, "Today we honor 29 Native Americans who gave their country a service only they could give." It was an acknowledgement not just of military success, but of cultural endurance. Chester Nez, frail but proud, responded simply, "We were ordinary men given an extraordinary task. We used our sacred language to help win the war. While the Navajo are the most famous, they were not alone." 14 other tribes contributed code talkers during World War II, each adapting their native languages into military communications. The Choctaw had pioneered the concept during World War I. The Comanche played a crucial role in Europe, sending unbreakable messages on D-Day and through the Normandy campaign. Hopi, Lakota, Cherokee, and other tribes also lent their voices to the war effort. In 2008, the Code Talkers Recognition Act officially honored all these tribes, acknowledging that native languages, once suppressed by government policy, had been indispensable to America's victory. John Brown Jr., a Navajo veteran, summed up the irony poignantly. "They told us our language was no good, then they needed it to win the war." Beyond the medals and ceremonies, the legacy of the Code Talkers lies in what their story symbolizes. They demonstrated that indigenous languages, far from being primitive or obsolete, are rich, sophisticated systems of communication capable of expressing the most complex human ideas. The Navajo Code had used linguistic structures, prefixes, tones, metaphors, that no machine could replicate. Dr. William Morgan, a linguist who studied the code after it was declassified, noted, "They proved that indigenous languages aren't relics of the past. They showed that Navajo could express anything, from ceremonies to warfare, with precision and power." The Code Talkers' success reshaped how Americans viewed native languages, transforming them from curiosities into sources of national strength and pride. Their influence even reached into the future of cryptography. Intelligence experts began to study the Navajo Code as an example of cultural encryption, a system based not on mathematics but on human language and world view. Colonel David Hatch of the U.S. Marine Corps later observed, "They achieved something unique, a code never broken, never compromised. It proved that human linguistic capability could exceed mechanical encryption." As the world now faces new technological frontiers, from artificial intelligence to quantum computing, the lesson of the Code Talkers remains relevant. True security may lie not only in algorithms, but in the complexity of human culture and thought. In Japan, decades later, the story also found a place of respect. In the 1980s, Japanese scholars and military historians began studying their nation's cryptographic failure with humility. Professor Tio Yoshikawa revealed that 30 analysts had worked exclusively on decoding the Navajo transmissions for 2 years, consulting multiple universities and research institutions. Captain Minoru Yamada admitted, "We knew it was a Native American language by late 1943, but could not identify which one." Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Fukimoto reflected on the simplicity of the idea. Using a native language was so elegant, we never considered it. In the 1990s, Japanese photographer Kenji Kawano traveled the United States to document surviving code talkers. His exhibitions in Tokyo and Hiroshima introduced Japanese audiences to the men whose voices they had once struggled to decode. Code talker Albert Smith told those audiences, "We were both warriors. My language helped defeat you, but now it helps us understand each other." Today, only a few code talkers remain alive. Among them is Peter MacDonald, former Navajo Nation president and one of the most vocal advocates for preserving their story. Speaking in his 90s, he often tells young people, "We showed that America's strength comes from diversity. Our different languages and cultures make us stronger." His words capture the deeper truth that the code talkers embodied, that unity does not require sameness, and that diversity, linguistic, cultural, and spiritual, is not a weakness, but a form of resilience. Across the Navajo Nation today, schools teach the code as both history and heritage. Federal and tribal funding supports programs that revitalize the Navajo language, connecting new generations to the voices that once carried victory across the Pacific. As historian Dr. Jennifer Dennett-Dale observed, the code talkers transformed how Native Americans see themselves and how America sees Native Americans. They proved that our languages aren't museum pieces, but living resources. The legacy of the Navajo Code Talkers is more than a chapter of military history. It is a story of cultural triumph over oppression, of resilience over erasure. In their Unbreakable code, they sent more than military messages. They sent a message to the world. It was a message that said language is identity, culture is strength, and diversity is America's unbreakable code. Long after the last transmission was sent and the last battle fought, the echoes of their voices remain, a living testament that some codes cannot be broken because they are written in the enduring language of human spirit.